Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about a motif that's found on early 18th century gravestones. Now, I mentioned them briefly in an earlier video. They're known colloquially as beaver angels because a significant number are located in the Vale of Belvoir, which straddles North Leicestershire and South Nottinghamshire. However, although there's lots in the Vale of Belvoir, the same motif is also found over a much wider area. Indeed, this motif is on late 17th century memorials in New England and Massachusetts, in the burial grounds associated with early Puritan settlers. Over there, slightly older memorials have winged skulls, although there are not many examples of these in England. This one, carved in 1709, is in the churchyard of St Peter's at Broadstairs on the Isle of Thanet. Now, posher and the more three-dimensional versions of these so-called beaver angels are found throughout England, inside churches, on war monuments. They came into vogue early in the 17th century, and, they're inspired by Italian amorini. This is all part of the whole classical art tradition that was coming into church monuments. And the original sense of amorini was winged heads, what we're talking about. And a different word, putti, was the name used for, let's call them chubby infants with wings. However, in recent years, popular usage has rather conflated amorini with putti, so if you mention amorini now, people think you're talking about a chubby infant with wings rather than a head with wings. These winged heads on 17th century memorials are known to British art historians as spiritus, and they're considered to depict the soul of the deceased. They have a second level of significance because putting one of those on your monument signified that you had what these days we would call high church sentiments. Pedantically, the term high church only comes into use with the Oxford movement of the 1830s, but it's a convenient term to use. So in the 17th century, these three-dimensional winged heads were thought to be the soul rising to heaven. And indeed, those more two-dimensional winged heads on the late 17th century gravestones in America are referred to as soul effigies. Now, this term must have been current in England before those families set off for the New World. So, at the time the so-called beaver angels were being carved in and around the Vale of Belvoir, we can reasonably assume that they would have been thought of as soul effigies too. Now, quite likely, they were influenced by Francis Quayle's book called Emblems, which was published in 1634 and became very popular. So, Quayle's ornate and metaphorical poetry was accompanied by, equally grotesque illustrations engraved by William Marshall and others. And the eighth of these emblems is called the Winged Soul. But so far as I can establish from online sources, the relevant illustration from 1634 depicts a full adult figure with wings, not just a winged head. But the book was republished as later editions with different and slightly less grotesque illustrations, and I've not been able to track all those down. So open question whether later illustrations of Quayle's book included a winged head. So, big question. If this motif was once known as a soul effigy, why did it become known as a beaver angel? Good question, and I haven't been able to come up with the answer. What I can tell you is that the term beaver angel is not used in a 1930s article written by Alfred Herbert, which is about the first article about Swindle and Slate memorials that we have. And the term beaver angels isn't used by Frederick Burgess in a seminal book on English churchyard memorials published in 1963. Burgess illustrates quite a few of these beaver angels, but in a quite exhaustive discussion of motifs on memorials, does not discuss the beaver angels, apart from a very brief remark in a couple of pages where he discusses angels. He deems the Vale of Belvoir angels to be mere folk art, and I quote, perhaps most removed from our present taste, unquote. Now, art historians of the 1950s and 1960s were decidedly snooty lot, so I think that's a fairly typical opinion. Reading through the whole of Burgess's book, he does not seem to be aware of the term soul effigy. which I think is understandable. But what I can say is that when I came back to Leicestershire in the mid-1980s and started looking at the local history and particularly these slate gravestones, they are quite remarkable, all I can say is that I seem to recall that the term Beaver Angel was being used by quite a lot of people. Can't remember seeing it in writing very much, but just chatting to people. Now, there's possible reasons for this, but my suspicion is, and I yet to prove it, that there was a member of the clergy, perhaps at Hickling or Upper or Nether Broughton, whose churchyards have a lot of these Beaver Angel motifs. He was the incumbent in the 1960s or 1970s, and quite likely read Frederick Burgess's book, and decided to sort of give them a more positive image, and along the way promoted the phrase Beaver Angel. Coming back to sort of more factual parts of these gravestones, now when we actually look at the Charnwood slate gravestones with the depictions of soul effigies, often it isn't the only decorative motif. You will also spot hourglasses and crossbones, of course, which both are emblems of mortality, and you also get phrases such as "Come ye blessed" and "To die is gain." Now, these are biblical references. "Come ye blessed" is from Matthew chapter 25, verses 34 to 36, and it's in this context taken to imply that the faithful will have a better life after death. Later memorials include depictions of the cross and crown. Now, this derives from James chapter 1, verse 12, and it conveys a similar sentiment to the effect that reward in heaven, the crown, will come after the trials of this life, the cross. I think we have to accept that 18th century biblical exegesis is a tad different to that in more recent centuries. But it made sense at the time, and it just about makes sense now. Now, when we get to the mid-17th century, the memorials no longer use the soul effigy, but they include a wide range of motifs of mortality. And the most dramatic are little sort of bas-reliefs of Father Time with a scythe and wings. And the scythe may even be held by a rather skeletal depiction of Death himself. So winged skulls, soul effigies, hourglasses, crossbones with or without skulls, depictions of Father Time, Death as the Grim Reaper, the nuances of the cross and crown motif. Altogether, these suggest that the families of the deceased had something of an obsession with the afterlife. And this is reinforced by the occasional depiction of an angel sounding the last trumpet, announcing the Day of Judgment. Well, since medieval times, and certainly throughout the 18th century, this signified that souls be reunited with their mortal remains and be resurrected. Although it's not explicitly stated on these 18th century memorials, the idea of reunification of body and soul at the Day of Judgment was clearly widely believed. If you want any more convincing, then read the descriptions on the headstones with soul effigies. They start with the words, "Here lies interres," "Here lies the body of," and similar expressions. So body and soul dominate the top half of these memorials. In the later 18th century, beliefs in the resurrection kind of die back a bit, and the gravestone wording changes to "in sacred memory of," or just a secular "in memory of." In turn, a few decades later, that evolves into "in loving memory of." So another question. If there's this obsession with body and soul in the early 18th century, was it associated with any specific denomination within the Church of England? Tricky question to answer, because in the early 18th century, everybody worshipped at the parish church and were buried at the parish church. And we have a little clue as to how diverse some of these people might have been, because David Lee looked into some very high-quality Charnwood slate memorials carved in the early 18th century by two generations of Pollards. They're in Quorn Parish Churchyard. David Lee has done a little bit of research on this to find out that these Pollards were also Baptist ministers, carving memorials for the parish church. Well, yes, it all makes sense at the time. It's only after nonconformists began establishing chapels in the later 18th century. Well, we can be sure that those buried in parish churches were more or less Anglican in outlook. And we know, as I said before, that in the late 17th and early 18th century, the memorials in the New World the ones with soul effigies, were associated with Puritans. But the term Puritan went out of use about the year 1700. Well, we know that individual beliefs have been pluralistic. They still are within the Church of England. Some people in the early 18th century were more Anglican, or as we would say now, High Church, than others. And there was indeed people in the early 18th century who wanted a much more Puritan style of liturgy. And they called themselves reformers. The people on the other side of the spiritual fence called them dissenters. The same people, I think. We also know by about the 1760s that Christians were using their churchyard memorials to make statements about their, shall we call it, religious identity. David Lee again identified quite a few gravestones in villages in and around Kings Norton, and also Wistow, Foston and Lowsby, all these within Leicestershire, and they depict the so-called passion symbols. Davies also noticed a headstone in one of the Leicester parish churches, St Mary de Castro, which also has these passion symbols. It's the memorial to Mary Bird, who died in 1765. Now, passion symbols mean only one thing. They mean that the person buried there identified as a Catholic. They would have been termed recusant Catholics because this is before the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1830, so you were not, you were a bit suspect really by religious standards. But seemingly not all recusant Catholics place passion symbols on their gravestones. We know that Eastwell was kind of owned, the whole village, which was an estate village, and it was owned by a family who were recusant Catholics. They actually built a Catholic chapel in the early 19th century, which has its own graveyard. The chapel still stands, but it's part of a house, and the chapel's graveyard was mostly built over about 20 years ago. But none of the gravestones in Eastwell Parish Churchyard have passion symbols. But perhaps in a village where possibly nearly everyone was Catholic, and there was no need to use a gravestone to express your identity. I suspect, and it is only a suspicion, I can't prove it, the soul effigies were a way for early 18th century families to express their association with specific beliefs. Well, yes, of course they must have been at least a little bit more wealthy than those who couldn't afford ornamentation on their memorials. But it's not simply about the presence or absence of ornamentation. It's about the choice of what is depicted. Nearest parallel is with buying a new car. Same money will buy you either a high mileage Porsche or a brand new Skoda. Different folks will prefer one to the other. Almost entirely because the two options make entirely different statements about social aspirations. The soul effigy and its associated mementi mori motifs is saying more than just, we can afford a fancy memorial. But another question, what religious movement may these symbols be associated with? Well, more work is needed. The most influential of the reformers at the time of the soul effigies was Matthew Henry. He lived from 1662 to 1714. He produced a voluminous amount of publications. At this stage, I have no idea if they were particularly concerned with the afterlife of the soul and the Day of Judgment. If anybody watching this video is familiar with Matthew Henry's commentary, then his exegeses of biblical passages might prove some interesting insights. Please email me. My email address is below. Further evidence that the soul effigies just might be associated with, shall we say, a dissenting sub-sect of the Church of England, rather than the Anglican or High Church end of the spectrum of beliefs, is where these motifs are most commonly found. Few are found in town graveyards. A few, yes, but not in the same numbers as some, but not all, rural churchyards. Now, a much more sophisticated survey is needed to confirm this. Anybody out there looking for a topic for an MA thesis? How about this? My impression is that the soul effigies are most likely to be found in villages which became associated with framework knitting, lace making, and later on boot and shoe outworking. The underlying reason is that some rural villages had absent landowners, quite often one of the Oxbridge colleges. They're known to historians as open villages, in distinction to closed villages, where the landowner lived in the parish and kept quite close control over who lived in the village, but that wasn't the case in open villages. What we do know is that people moving to open villages were more likely to be dissenters. These villages acquire a sequence of chapels, perhaps starting with the Anabaptist or Quakers, Anabaptist chapel, followed by a Wesleyan Methodist place of worship, and then one for the primitive Methodists. But all of that is around 100 years after the soul effigies were being carved. Back then, in the early 18th century, Reformers and Anglicans were buried together in the parish churchyard. But the motifs on someone's memorial made a statement, perhaps about the deceased religious beliefs, and certainly about those of their surviving family who commissioned the gravestone. Now, the Vale of Belvoir has a high proportion of open villages. So, most of the churchyards have so-called beaver angels, soul effigies. But this motif is far from exclusive to North Leicestershire and South Nottinghamshire. Here's an example from North Northamptonshire. So, to me, it seems, well, intentionally ignorant to continue to call them beaver angels, when clearly when they were carved they would have been known as soul effigies. Hence the title of this video, Goodbye Beaver Angels, Hello Soul Effigies. And just as a little sort of amusing ending, winged skulls and winged heads have a modern, albeit secular successor in Ohio. This is the memorial to the legendary baseball player Cy Young. One of my good friends, Ian Brown, is reminded of the golden snitch in Quidditch. Ian's knowledge of the Harry Potter books is much better than mine, and informs me that in the final book, in the final film, one called Resurrection Stone, the eponymous stone brings back loved ones from the dead, and it's hidden inside the golden snitch. Probably just coincidence, but it's not impossible that J.K. Rowling was aware of Cy Young's tomb.